The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.
Ukraine continues to defy expectations in fighting off the Russian invaders. But is this war any closer to a conclusion? And how close are both sides to some kind of spring offensive? We'll examine the state of the war tonight. Then, what the Alberta election results portend for the rest of Canada. And on World No Tobacco Day, an update on Canadian lawsuits to recover healthcare costs incurred treating tobacco-related diseases. It's Wednesday, May 31st, and that's all next on The Agenda. After almost a year and a half of brutal fighting, Ukraine's efforts to push back the invading Russian forces are now suspected to include drone attacks that have even penetrated the Russian capital itself. But is there a bigger spring offensive in the offing? And how steadfast are Ukraine's Western allies still? Let's ask. In our nation's capital, Andrew Rasiulis, fellow with the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, who served in a variety of roles over almost 3 decades in the Canadian Department of National Defense. And Jeff Sahadeo, director of the Institute of European, Russian and Eurasian Studies at Carleton University. In London, Ontario, Erica Simpson, associate professor of international relations at Western University and the president of the Canadian Peace Research Association. And here in our studio, Janice Stein, the Bellsberg Professor of Conflict Management and founding director of the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy at the University of Toronto. Janice, as always, great to see you again. And to our friends in Points Beyond, we appreciate your joining us on TVO tonight. Let's start with this. Janice, how is, to the best of your knowledge, Ukraine's resistance holding up?
It's remarkable how well and how long it has held up. We are on the verge of what the Ukrainians are describing as a counteroffensive. But what's interesting, Steve, is Ukrainians themselves are now trying to manage expectations.
What does that mean?
Which means that some of them are worried that this counteroffensive has been overhyped. They are facing Russian forces that are dug in with trenches and barbed wire fortification, reminiscent almost of World War I. So they are trying to manage expectations and reduce the hope that this will be the breakthrough that will push Russian forces back to the line.
Jeff, let's do a little state of facts on the ground right now. How much of pre-2014 Ukraine is now controlled by Russia, to the best of your knowledge?
Well, Russia is controlling parts of the 4 provinces that they claim to have annexed in the fall of 2022. So the Zaporozhye area, Donetsk, Luhansk, and they've moved their lines forward, but it's really been static within the last, since really the summer offensive that the Russians had. And of course, Ukraine pushed Russia out of Kherson in the south and have pushed Russia back in the northeast as well. So as Janice was saying, the front lines have relied largely static. Russia's controlling a good chunk of Ukrainian territory, a good chunk of Ukrainian resources, maybe about a quarter of it. But really, neither side is satisfied with the status quo right now, which is why this war continues to drag on.
Let's admit that there's a lot of fog of war that we're all trying to wade through here, because no one can be 100% certain about necessarily anything here. But Andrew, from what you can gauge, is Russia yet feeling the fatigue of this war?
Well, they're dealing with it. And the attacks on Moscow certainly are not helping the Russian situation. Putin is trying to keep a cool, calm look on it, calling it a counter-terrorist operation. But the Russian people themselves, I mean, they may have been shaken up in Moscow, but on the whole, they remain committed to the war as long as it doesn't really affect them very much. So we should not expect the Russians to break anytime soon. In fact, you could argue that over time, if they maintain their defensive positions, as Janice has described, very strong, then the Russian will be able to sustain the war into 2024. The question is, can the Ukrainians do that? And that's really the debate between the attritional warfare here.
Well, that takes me to a question for Erica, which is, in your judgment, how much of a difference have Western sanctions and Western weapons deliveries to Ukraine made in this war so far?
Well, I'm going to emphasize that the Russians, in reply to Janice's comment about managing as we move toward the negotiation table, so we're in the pre-negotiations, what we have to recognize is the Russians have already lost more than 200,000 casualties. They've had desertions. They have lost, the Wagner group lost 20,000 out of 50,000 people in Bakhmut. So their casualties are high, or way higher than they expected. They went into Kyiv, into Ukraine with 120 forces. They've now lost more than 200,000 people. And so we've got to factor that in addition to the munitions and the supplies, the F-35s, the fighter jets that the Poles are giving, the Leopards that the Germans and the Canadians are giving. The NATO allies have really united here very strongly, and I think that the Russians did not ever expect this kind of unity and alliance coherence.
Janice, those are astonishingly big numbers, but on the other hand, Russia is a lot bigger than Ukraine. Can they therefore sustain these losses in a more long-lasting way?
I think that's the really big question. Roughly 3 times the size of Ukraine. But Ukraine is a very big country. And the Russian army, certainly the army that Putin had mobilized, never had the capacity to execute on the battle plan. The most charitable interpretation, he was misled by his own generals who were afraid to tell him the truth. That fog of war, as you put it, Steve, has dissipated. And the reason this counteroffensive matters so much, I don't think we should look at it only in terms of the amount of territory that Ukraine can take back.
How else should we look at it?
How many Russian troops are left standing at the end of this, because then Vladimir Putin will be confronted with a very tough decision. Does he order a second wave of mobilization? And there are interesting polls in Russia about Russian support. All of us would admit it's really hard to do good public opinion sampling, but the more independent pollsters in Moscow, what they're showing is what we would call thin support. They're not showing opposition, but the support is thin. And another large mobilization of the kind that Putin was forced to do last September is not something I suspect that he wants to do.
Andrew, let's pick up the story with the spring offensive, so-called, that Ukraine is apparently planning. Again, no one knows for sure, but if you were a general looking at the battlefield, how would you see that playing out over the next several weeks and or months?
Well, from the Ukrainian point of view, their weakest spot is people power. The West can supply them weapons, and they are supplying all the weapons the Ukraine more or less needs. However, they are not going to supply people, because NATO is not going to go to war with Russia. So the Ukrainians have a diminishing pool of people that they can put into the fight. And this upcoming offensive, this is a deliberate offensive being planned by Ukraine against a deliberate Russian defense. And we have not seen this in the war as yet, where both sides are fully prepared, fully determined, and casualties should be expected to be quite high. The Russians are fortified. So if you're a Ukrainian general, you're looking at this, how do I attack, minimizing my casualties, at the same time knowing that I will not achieve the strategic objective of Ukraine, which is to push the Russians back to the 1991 borders, including Crimea. Now, that puts Ukraine into an everlasting war, almost a renewed offensive in the fall, perhaps, after suffering significant casualties and pressure from the West and others that maybe it's time to look at a ceasefire, which the Ukrainians desperately do not want to look at a ceasefire. So alternatively, Ukrainians might be looking at new ways of attacking, not a large-scale offensive, but small probing offensives that bite away at the Russian lines without the Ukrainians sustaining heavy casualties. The drone attacks, these attacks in Belgorod and so on, are part of wearing down the Russians. So that could be a new innovative way that the Ukrainians are doing, because in a classic way, they're going to hit the Russian line, try to punch through, threaten Crimea in your Kherson, and sustain heavy casualties, and be forced to examine a prospect of a ceasefire or keep fighting in 2024.
Jeff, can you pick up on that? How do you see a potential spring offensive playing out?
Yeah, I would agree with Andrew completely on this. And for all the losses of manpower that Russia has had, Ukraine suffers more when it's 1-to-1 or even 2-to-1 situations. And of course, once you have an offensive, the offensive forces confronting forces dug in are generally expected to lose more in terms of human casualties. So I think this is why we have seen continued delay in the offensive, this managing of expectations that Janice mentioned, this effort to have these missile strikes around Belgorod, potentially in Moscow. And just as Moscow is itself hitting Kiev with missiles, trying to wear down the Ukrainian defenses and trying to wear down Ukrainian anti-aircraft, trying to force them to defend a broader scope of territory as well. So we're going to see moves and counter moves in the next few months, more like Andrew described, rather than one of these massive offensives that we saw in the fall, where Ukraine was able to punch through the Russian lines because the fortifications are just too tight right now, and Ukraine has to watch every man so carefully.
Yeah, Erica, maybe you could pick up on that in as much as if there's an understanding in Ukraine that a sort of typical massive spring offensive isn't going to achieve the strategic objectives that one would expect, I don't mean this question to sound naive, but is there any point in doing it then?
Well, I mean, I think if I was a Ukrainian general, I would be very concerned about the coming winter, because Russian tanks are more maneuverable in the winter. And so I'd be wanting this counteroffensive to succeed. But at the same time, I think it's very true to say that this is really an international campaign where Zelensky has to travel internationally and try to get support. And so they need to sound as if they're going to have a success. And frankly, whatever happens can be interpreted as a success by the West. And that's the problem, is we will never actually really know, just like in Afghanistan, where we were constantly told that, oh, the Afghan National Security Forces have captured 51% of the country, yeah. In the end, we found out, no. So what I'm saying is, it's kind of media. It's kind of a situation where we in the West want them to win, but we won't really ever know. And this war could drag on for years and years. The only thing I think that could happen would be that Putin dies. He's in a cocoon. He's not seeing anyone. They have to wait up for a week to see him. Maybe if he dies or he retires early somehow, then that might change how we get to the table. But we've got to get to the table. And so I don't think the number of deaths is important. It's what Putin does. I'd like to hear what Janice thinks about that.
Okay, we're going to find that out right now.
I'm agreeing with everybody here that this offensive, however it unfolds, and I tend to think it will be, and they're telegraphing this, the Ukrainians are, it'll be a series of smaller ones rather than roll the dice on one big one. You know, when the Ukrainians broke through last year, and it's very important that people understand that in the West, the Russians had not had time to do what they've done now, which is to prepare, dig in, and fortify. So it's going to be much, much more expensive in lives and casualties. So I think the Ukrainians are well aware of that. Where I'm less optimistic a little bit than Erica is about the timing of getting to the table. You know, Russia has a track record of freezing conflicts and never going to the table. And I don't think we can rule that out. And I think it's very interesting. There is an idea being discussed now quietly among NATO members, which in some sense is the biggest roll of the dice that you can imagine. But there is an interior logic to it. There is no going to the table with Putin, and hoping that Putin dies is not a strategy. Let me just put it to you that way.
It's a wish, but it's not a strategy.
It's a wish, it's not a strategy. So there is discussion. This is coming up actually in the quarters of NATO at the Vilnius meeting. Admit Ukraine to NATO. And what are they invoking? It's really, really interesting. They are invoking West and East Germany. West Germany was admitted to NATO. It was a divided country. Admit Ukraine to NATO, because only by escalating the risk will you will be able to force Russia to stop fighting, because then it is an attack against NATO. It's not against Ukraine.
Let's get some feedback on that.
Hugely risky. Hugely
risky strategy. Jeff, would you recommend it?
That's a risky strategy. I just don't see Turkey going for it, for example, which is going to be, if you need unanimous NATO approval, I can't see them getting every country in. I can see the thought of taking a risk, because what's happening now is the West is supplying just enough to allow Ukraine to continue the war in sort of the static fashion, but not enough to win it. So maybe you have to take a risk somewhere. But in this case, I think the risk is that you try it and then it just doesn't work. I would say, rather than Putin dying, the biggest risk to this all, or might get them to the table in a different way, is if, say, we see President Trump in 2024, right? Or a real change in Germany or in the United States or one of these Western countries where you see this fatigue. And already you see it in some of these Western countries with, even in Poland, for example, when they are trying to restrict Ukrainian grain exports. So the because Western regimes have to respond in a democratic fashion, and there's a limited amount of pain that Western consumers and Western public is going to take. So where do you take the risk? And it's a series of not very good choices for the West, and this is one of the not very good choices.
Andrew, I'm going to ask you a completely facetious question, which is, I heard Donald Trump say on his CNN town hall that if he were elected president in 2024, he could end this war in 24 hours. So should we all be praying for a Trump victory to see that happen?
Well, it depends if you're Ukrainian, because the Trump's peace solution is essentially an immediate ceasefire, stop the supplies of ammunitions and equipment to Ukraine, which then forces them to agree to a ceasefire, and the Russians get to keep everything they're holding. So that's how you bring it about in 24 hours, more or less.
Gotcha. Let me ask you a follow-up, which is, it is a bit of a strange war in as much as the Western allies have been really asking Ukraine to fight with one hand tied behind their back the whole time, in as much as they're not allowed really to attack Russia.
With NATO-supplied equipment.
With NATO-supplied equipment.
With their own.
Okay. How problematic is all of that to getting this thing to the finish line?
Well, the problem is always when you're fighting in a nuclear environment, there's inherent limitations. The Americans, when they fought in Vietnam, North Vietnam was not a nuclear power, but it was supported by a nuclear power of the Soviets and so on. And the Americans had self-imposed restrictions in how they conducted the Vietnam War in terms of bombing and so on. Korea was the same thing. MacArthur wanted to go into China. But they couldn't do these things. So the fact that there are limitations is quite natural when you're talking about a nuclear power. And if you're going to fight a conventional war, you have to fight it underneath the nuclear threshold, since there's no logic engaging in nuclear weapons. And that brings about inherent limitations, where you don't put the nuclear holding power, in this case Russia, in a position where it says, okay, I'm existentially threatened and I'm going to start making all sorts of nuclear plays against you. So the fact that there are limitations is actually quite normal, and is part of how you negotiate in that environment. Korea was negotiated after 2 years of stalemate, where the Americans of the United Nations Command knew there was only a certain limit that they could do. And at the end of the day, they had to saw off. Nobody liked the 53 armistice, and there's been no political deal. There's no end to that war. We may have this situation in Ukraine and Russia, where we may get eventually a ceasefire because people get exhausted, but there will be no political agreement on giving away that land to Russia that they're going to hold.
All right. Having said that, Erica, can you imagine a set of circumstances where Ukraine disregards the admonition that it currently fights under, which is no attacks on Russian soil with NATO weapons? Can you imagine that happening?
I certainly can, because of the drone attacks on the richest areas of Russia where the elite live. So as soon as that happened a few days ago, where 8 drones were sent, I thought, well, if they're foolish enough to attack the Crimean Peninsula, which is where Russia's Black Sea Fleet is located, if they're foolish enough to think that they can retake the Crimean Peninsula, then we're entering a whole new gray zone of warfare. So Andrew was talking about the threshold, the nuclear threshold, the Article 5 threshold, where an attack against one of us is an attack against us all. I'd be very concerned that Ukraine will never be able to become a NATO ally, simply because of the worry that Ukraine would do something like this, would unwisely attack Russia, using perhaps fighter jets from Poland, and thus causing a conflagration and a war. So my main kind of solace is that I don't think, like Janice thinks, that NATO will accept Ukraine. They'll talk about it. They've talked about it for years. They've dangled membership.
That's right.
They've said you can be a partner but not an ally. And behind the scenes, they've been very clear that Ukraine will not be a NATO ally. If Sweden cannot be a NATO ally with Erdogan at the helm, he's at the helm again. You will never get Ukraine. They will never have a consensus. So that's a pipe dream. And that's a way of deluding Western democracies into thinking that maybe NATO will protect Ukraine. No, they're on it. They're in it alone with tons of billions of dollars of equipment, but they're in it alone. So that is why I am concerned.
Janice, I want to follow up on this drone attack again. What did you think about the advisability of Ukraine using drones to attack deep inside Russia?
Look, there's a Ukrainian calculus and there's a NATO calculus. They're not the same. Right? There was not 100% convergence, which is something that people don't like to talk about, but Erica's really just put it on the table. The drones that were used in that attack on Moscow were Ukrainian-made drones. They were not NATO weapons.
So they haven't violated any agreements with NATO.
And, there is very clear, there's been a conversation back and forth. I do not believe that the Ukrainians would use any NATO-supplied weaponry to attack, or certainly over the February 24th line. Crimea, that's a whole other subject. And the reason for that, Steve, were that to happen, that would put a chill on the willingness of NATO members to supply equipment, any equipment that can be considered for offensive use. And that would be a huge liability for Ukraine.
And Zelensky will not risk that.
I do not believe that Zelensky would ever take that risk. It's just such a terrible blow.
Well, I think,
Ukraine.
Andrew, let me bring you in on this. I guess a lot of observers have been surprised at how reasonably well the Western allies have steadfastly stuck with Ukraine to this juncture. I mean, not a lot of the world has not, but a lot of Western allies have. I wonder, as you look at this, make the calculus. What would it take for Western allies to lose the political will they have so far demonstrated in sticking with Ukraine?
Well, the popular narrative on that is that if the war grinds on, as it very well might, and you get to this thing in 2023, there's a pressure for ceasefire, not peace negotiate, ceasefire. And let's say the Ukrainians reject it and they continue to say, no, we're going to keep going. And the Russians manage to sustain themselves despite perhaps losing some territory, but they can do a counterattack and the war grinds. And so to use that term, it becomes to many people a forever war. And then you've got the pressure of the American election, with Republicans, DeSantis and Trump both saying they would reconsider their options. And I think at that point, the public may wane in certain countries. In Italy, it's down to 30% of support for Ukraine. So I think this is not to be assumed that the West's support will be indefinite under all circumstances. I think there may be an expectation for some kind of a ceasefire agreement at some point in time. And the Ukrainians will be resisting that, and that's going to be an interesting calculus.
Janice, but the Italian Prime Minister has been absolutely steadfast in her support for Zelensky. But what do you see as concerns on the horizon on that front?
Yeah, she has, Meloni, but because she was retreating from a campaign, Steve, and then she became prime minister. And prime ministers talk differently when they're prime ministers than they do when they're campaigning.
She hugged Zelensky and said, "We're with you to the end." She was very firm.
I'm very dubious about the length of support, especially as Andrew just said, if we are in a war of attrition, and a stalemated front line, which could conceivably, where will it crack first? The obvious one, unbelievable as it is, the United States in 2024, which is not far.
If there's a change in president.
If there's a change in president, and just imagine, there is no supply of equipment here without the United States, frankly. It's provided, depending on how you count, something like 80% of what Ukraine has gotten. The Germans are, under the surface, not happy. They are looking for a way. There are articles in European press. What do we do to make the Germans stand up? I mean, that's fundamentally it. France, we have a uniquely idiosyncratic Gaullist President Macron, who doesn't think that it's appropriate to have a forever war. So who are we talking about? Italy, Germany, France, the United States, where there are conceivable timelines here. When we listen to the East European, the Baltic, Central European leaders, we get one message. When you move west, the further away you are from the battlefield and the Russian armies, you're getting very different messages. There are cracks here beneath the surface.
Jeff, is one of those cracks Canada? Or how steadfast have we been?
Oh, no.
I think Canada is probably one of the most steadfast countries, and it's very difficult to imagine we would be anything but the last domino to fall in this situation.
I agree.
Because of the large Ukrainian diaspora that we have here, our traditional support for Ukraine, Prime Minister Trudeau is not necessarily ensconced in power in the next couple of years, but we haven't heard much even from Poilievre or any politicization of Ukrainian aid. So I think Canada can be quite counted on as a steadfast ally. I mean, the main issue for Canada will be once this conflict is over, one of the tensions that's happening now is Ukraine will be expecting the hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians who have come to Canada to return. Whereas many of the Ukrainians who have come here to Canada have made themselves a life here and would like to stay. So this is going to be a big question. Once there's a ceasefire, if there's a ceasefire, wars do end, what happens to all these Ukrainians who are abroad now in Canada or elsewhere? How do you get them to come back to a country that's suffered so much devastation? And what will Western countries do about that? So that'll be an issue where Canada and Ukraine, I think there may be some form of tension or negotiation there.
The other issue, just on Jeff's point, there's a second issue just looming over the horizon. Canada's been a strong financial supporter of Ukraine too, done more, relatively speaking, than others. The needs are astronomical, and when and if there's a ceasefire, the discussion of a Marshall Plan for Ukraine, rebuilding Ukraine, how much will Canada do in an environment where, frankly, cash is not limitless? Then it's possible that it becomes a more politicized issue in this country.
We've got about 5 minutes to go here. And Erica, let me bring you in on the issue of whether or not anybody knows if there are so-called back-channel talks or negotiations happening. Can you help us on that front?
I am not a NATO official, and I do not know if they're a back channel, but I do think that if we look at the situation of Afghanistan, there were many back channel discussions even after April 2021 when they decided to withdraw. I'm sure there's back channel discussions about a Marshall Plan 2.0 as well that has been proposed. But I myself do not know if there are any back channel discussions about getting to the table and having a negotiation at a table like at Doha regarding Afghanistan. I have not heard anything myself.
Andrew, what about you on that?
Well, the Chinese are very active. They've been to Kyiv, they've been to Moscow. So I think they're laying that path for potential ceasefire when the two warring sides are ready for it. They know they're not ready today, but the Chinese are laying the track. They're putting in a pathway. The Vatican has expressed interest. So these things are happening. And the Turks, of course, with the grain deal, they're always willing to make deals there as well. So I believe that the communication channels exist. The Chinese are a bit openly maneuvering to do that. But the time is yet not right. But the Chinese, I think, and others are laying the groundwork for the day when it may be right.
Jenna, should we be encouraged or nervous about the Chinese laying the groundwork for those back channels?
Oh, no, I think we should be encouraged. I understand well why Zelensky may be alarmed, because the Chinese have certainly not adopted what we would call a neutral position, but I think keeping those channels of communication open is really important. Here's one back channel that we know is happening all the time between Moscow and Washington. There are talks going on all the time, and largely...
At what level do you suppose?
Oh, at the very senior-most levels between...
As in White House to Kremlin?
Not White House to Kremlin, but chiefs of defense staff to chiefs of defense staff. There are conversations between intelligence to intelligence. Some of this, you could say, is what we call deconfliction. What do we do in the event of an emergency? And military leaders always talk to each other, but there's more there.
Okay, let's finish up on this. And Jeff, I'll go to you first on this. This is one of these real speculative questions where I ask, if you were advising Zelensky, would you urge him to keep going until he reconquers every square inch of his territory that Russia now holds? Or would you urge him to settle for something less and let's get this war over?
I definitely would not encourage him to try and push Russia back to the 1991 borders. I think, as we've talked about earlier, Crimea is a red line, and I don't think the international community would support him. I think he does have to start to manage expectations, and I think what's going to be critical is to try to stay out of what Andrew talked about before, which is the typical Russian tactic, which they've done in Georgia and Moldova, of nurturing a frozen conflict. It's in Russia's interest to kind of keep the pot kind of semi-boiling, and Russia can turn up or down the temperature. So to have some kind of set negotiation where there is a sort of set boundary, Ukraine may be having to give up territory, maybe even past the 2014 border, but to stay out of this frozen conflict, and perhaps with this Marshall Plan 2.0, and maybe even at that point, some kind of NATO potential if Zelensky is willing to give this up. But the problem for Zelensky, I mean, it's a problem for Putin too, but less of a problem, is this has become an existential battle for both regimes. And it's going to be very difficult to prime the Ukrainian public to make sacrifices territorially when they've fought so hard. So it's a very difficult situation for President Zelensky.
I wish we had another half an hour for this group, because that was a real smart conversation. I want to thank Andrew Rasiulis, Jeff Sahadeo, Erica Simpson, and Janice Stein for joining us on TVO tonight for a great conversation about this awful war. Take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Provincial elections in Alberta always used to be foregone conclusions. For 44 straight years, the Conservatives always won big. Not so this past Monday night, when the United Conservatives just eked out a narrow majority government win, as the New Democrats showed a lot of moxie. Here to unpack it all, let's welcome in Calgary, Alberta, political analyst and PhD candidate at the University of Calgary. There's Jason Ribeiro. Jason, good to have you on our program. Let me just, as I welcome you here, ask our director, Sheldon Osmond, to bring up the results. We got a graphic here with the results of the UCP's majority government win, but it was a tight one. 49-seat victory the other night, 926,000 plus votes for a 52.6% share of the total vote, compared to the New Democrats, who got 38 seats. That's the biggest opposition seat count in Alberta history. On the strength of 776,000 plus votes, a 44% share, which in Ontario, 44% would have got you a massive majority government. Those numbers may dance around a little bit, because I know there's a few seats where they're asking for recounts, but what do you think Albertans essentially were saying the other night with those results?
Well, they're telling the not only Alberta, but the rest of the country that we haven't sort of figured out, what kind of province we are. Throw out the traditional lore of this being a conservative stronghold province that's going to be traditionally blue, but also, throw out the notion that despite all of the challenges that this conservative government has faced over the last 4 years, that they're ready to throw them out over it. So you're seeing historic gains, you're seeing demographic changes also play a factor here, but then you're also seeing the nitty-gritty of campaign tactics. The NDP, placing a huge emphasis on Calgary, particularly as the UCP was going through its own leadership election, got a bit of a jump and just squeaked over some battleground ridings, but wasn't enough to carry the day. I think the story of what this means for Alberta is going to still be being written over the next weeks and months and potentially years to come.
For sure. The NDP did sweep Edmonton. They got a lot of seats in Calgary, unlike last time. Danielle Smith, the Premier, who remains Premier, she did win, but she got 100,000 fewer votes this time compared to last time. Where do you think those people went?
I think they stayed home. Even though our turnout was, plus 60%, wasn't the 70% that you saw in 2019, where you had a very motivated province and citizenry come to the table, especially after a few years of economic tumult, to elect Jason Kenney to a large majority government. This time around, the polarization, the intense I think, clear contrast between the choices of Team Orange and Team Blue, forced a lot of people to stay home. And as you saw the undecided be a large chunk of the electorate in poll after poll after poll, the traditional thinking is probably start to think of them as non-voters. It seems that either voting for the NDP or the UCP was a bridge too far for some folks.
One of the anomalies of our first past the post system is that sometimes the number of votes you get does not always translate into the number of seats you get exactly. And I raise that because Rachel Notley actually got more votes this time than she did 8 years ago when she won a majority government. But the votes split differently this time. What do you think prevented her? She clearly had a good campaign, good enough to knock Danielle Smith off her perch a little bit. But what prevented her from victory, do you think?
Well, look, I think it's a few things. One, ceding the entirety of rural Alberta to one party means you're already starting on the back foot, right? And the UCP stronghold kept. They didn't splinter off into any of the other farther to the right leaning parties. That conservative coalition, I've always said, even though there's infighting during a period of governance, when the quote unquote enemy is common, as it was here, they pretty much fall into line and coalesce. I think that, was an impediment to Rachel Notley. I think the second part is that despite the fact that it looked all good from the outside, while candidates were strong on the ground, knocking doors, pounding pavement, making calls, I think that the macro campaign for the NDP lacked a certain oomph. They'd mirrored some of the UCP policies. They'd moved farther into the center. And I think that didn't lead to a lot of inspiration in their base, even though they were united, and didn't call enough people over from the UCP in 2019 to come vote for them. Those folks stayed home. And I think also those folks did not, show up in droves. What it actually ended up doing was coalescing the Alberta Liberals, the Alberta Party. Basically, what Rachel Notley can hang her hat on is that she's, essentially defined this province as a two-party province now. Jason Kenney did it in 2019 by bridging the Wild Rose and the PCs together. Rachel Notley has consumed or assumed all of those remaining sort of center-left to left parties under her banner. There's something to take there for the future.
Now, not every provincial election has national implications, but to be sure, Alberta elections do. Premier Smith's victory, what do you think that portends for national politics?
I wish I could tell you, this is which Danielle Smith do I believe? During the, before her run in politics, when she had taken a break after being ousted as Wild Rose leader some years ago, she's waxed poetic about a number of issues and topics as a broadcaster, as a podcaster, as a business, quote unquote, advocate. And then she very much took aim at Ottawa during her leadership election. That softened. That softened when she became the premier. And so all of a sudden, the Sovereignty Act, which was this critical piece of legislation that she was going to shove in Justin Trudeau's face, all of a sudden got watered down. All of the rhetoric got tampered down. With a thin majority, does this embolden her to think of it as a big majority? Or does it allow her to keep in this tempered realm where they're working together on healthcare and have secured historic funding, where they're going to work together on things that matter to Albertans like childcare and the like? And certainly, the federal government has invested a heavy amount of loans and debt and resources into our energy sector. Does this become a more productive relationship, or does that famous image of Jason Kenney putting his finger in Justin Trudeau's face become the image that also Danielle Smith wears in the years to come from a governance perspective?
Maybe you could help an Ontario audience understand this, because my suspicion is that if a party leader in this province had compared people who take the COVID vaccination to blind supporters of Adolf Hitler, or who had a candidate say some rather unfortunate things about some people in our society, enough so that Premier Smith has now kicked her out of caucus and said, even though she won, she will not sit in the Conservative caucus. There'd be some problems with that. You'd wonder how a candidate who had done all that could win an election. Can you explain to us how, in spite of all of her malapropisms, she somehow still managed a majority win?
Yeah, and as a former Ontarian myself, I can shed some light here and bridge some of those gaps. I think this is hugely challenging. She has said things that I think were not only a bridge too far from folks that prevented her from getting a larger majority, but I know that she's said things that even the diehard, true blue conservatives are saying it's a bridge too far. The challenge is, though, there's this equivocation between what Rachel Notley has said about the energy sector, what her candidates have said, that places them into a quandary. And many of them are still breaking towards Danielle Smith. Candidates in their own ridings were saying, listen, if she gets a thin majority or the margin isn't there, she may be out, even if she wins this election. The fact that, some of these candidates were campaigning against the statements that she'd made very directly, I think it makes for a bizarre mix heading into an election. But I think this is one of the most, impressive, but also disheartening political comebacks in modern Canadian political history. And I don't think it says something specifically about Albertans, let's be clear. There were droves of people who did not vote for Danielle Smith, not just based on policy, not just based on ideology, based on the backs of those statements. Civic society, civil society here condemned all of those statements. I was personally offended by those statements. But for some, the trade-off between inflation, affordability, cost of living, some of the issues where the UCP pulled the strongest, for many of them, I do feel it places them in a bit of a quandary. It places generational feelings about voting blue your whole life into perspective. And for everyone that hasn't made that step to vote for a different party, especially one that is painted as the enemy or painted as being on the farthest end of the spectrum, I can empathize and understand why that is such a challenge and whether that leads to them holding their nose and still voting blue or staying home for this election.
Well, let me do a little comparing and contrasting here, because in the last decade, Ontario's had 2 premiers and Alberta has had 6. 6 premiers in the last 10 years. And one of the narratives I heard during the course of the Alberta election campaign was, put the Conservatives back in power and don't worry, Smith is going to self-destruct. We'll get rid of her and put somebody else in. And given how you kind of churned through premiers over the last decade, that had some credibility. First of all, you've heard that narrative, no doubt. Are you buying that's maybe what could take place in the next couple of years?
Well, history is a great precedent, right? So I wouldn't count that scenario out. I will say this. Danielle Smith became, incredibly disciplined during the campaign. Rachel Notley had a great opportunity to speak to Albertans during the debate. I think even folks within the progressive movement said that Danielle Smith won that debate handedly, relying on her years of broadcasting experience. But certainly, it's funny enough to say that the most, stable tenure over the last decade or more from a premier's perspective is Rachel Notley. She's the only one to have finished her term. And so I don't think Danielle can look to, a great UCP dynasty in the future no more than Jason Kenney could, even though he had all of the support. The world is changing fast, and her ability to adapt, her ability to recover, and the amount of rope that folks within her own party are giving her, and Albertans more broadly, especially being shut out of one of the major cities in this province, means that she has a lot of work to do. If history is a precedent, it's not necessarily in her favor. And I think this is going to be the challenge between the optics and the reality. The analogy that I use has been the presidential election in 2016. Trump won very small by a very thin majority, acted like he had a majority. Let's see if Danielle Smith does that as well over the next 4 years if she makes it there.
Got about a minute and change left here to talk about Rachel Notley, and I'm intrigued by her situation, because if someone had been premier, as she had been, and then she tried to get the job back but lost, you might expect to hear some people in her party saying, maybe it's time we try for a new leader, particularly since she's the longest serving current member of the Legislative Assembly in Alberta. I'm picking up none of that. I'm hearing nothing about let's get rid of Rachel Notley. How come?
Well, their party is extremely united. They've been united for some time, especially as the divisions between the UCP opposite have been taking shape. It is a party, just like, the UCP for a period of time was molded in Jason Kenney's image, so is the Alberta NDP. And while I know for a fact that calls are being made and people are sticking their necks out to be considered as a future or potential leader, if Rachel decides that she's not going anywhere, or at least for a period of time, she may be playing the calculus of saying exactly what you said prior. Danielle Smith may self-destruct. The UCP may fracture. This is a very thin majority where they will have to whip votes. Even one of the people that you counted as part of that thin majority is sitting as an independent outside of caucus, and they don't need to bring her in right now. I think they're going to wait and see what happens and see if there's anyone inside the party or potentially outside that could potentially fill Rachel Notley's shoes. But I don't think that that's an evident case right now.
Gotcha. Jason, it's good to meet you. We appreciate your time and your analysis on what was a most fascinating election, and we hope we'll see you again somewhere down the road. Jason Ribeiro, PhD candidate, University of Calgary, and a political analyst from out west. Thanks for joining us tonight here on TVO.
Thanks for having me.
A quarter of a century ago, facing lawsuits from several states and the U.S. government, the tobacco industry agreed to change its marketing practices and pay more than $200 billion in damages. Provinces here in Canada launched similar lawsuits, looking to recover the healthcare costs incurred due to tobacco-related illness. But if you're waiting for a similar billion-dollar punchline, you're not alone. With us now to explain, Sarah Butson. She's public affairs and policy analyst with the Canadian Lung Association, and we're delighted to have you here on this important day on our calendar.
Thanks for having me.
How would you describe the behavior of tobacco companies in Canada over the last couple of decades?
Well, I think the best way to describe it is an unparalleled history of wrongdoing. So this is an industry that we know has had a history of directly trying to attract young recruits to become their next generation of users. We know that there has been a history of misleading and misrepresenting the product to conceal the dangers that really are part of that product. So it's, most of us will remember the days of mild and light cigarettes that, implied some sort of safety to those products that was just completely false. And we saw aggressive marketing around Slims for females, for example, to make them Virginia Slims. Yeah. Making them more attractive. But the reality is this is a harmful product that kills 1 in 2 when used as intended. So it's really, a tainted history, unlike most industries.
Profitable, though.
Very profitable.
Mm-hmm. Can you give us, maybe just walk us through a bit of the history of tobacco-oriented lawsuits in Canada?
Sure. So our first lawsuit in Canada was in British Columbia. That was in the early 2000s, actually. And what's significant about that case is that the right to actually sue was challenged as part of that. And what the courts found is that, in fact, provinces can sue the tobacco companies. And so as a result, one by one, the provinces began to sue. So fast forward many years, we actually had an additional case in Quebec. This was a class action lawsuit. About 100,000 residents in Quebec who were suffering from lung cancer, throat cancer, emphysema. They sued as well. And what's significant about that is that they won. So they won a settlement of over $13 billion.
When did that happen?
That happened back in 2019. Mm-hmm. So at that time, the tobacco industries looked at that class action suit. They looked at the variety of suits that were against them, and they said, we're going to enter into bankruptcy protection. So they've been in bankruptcy protection since 2019. And that's what brings us to this conversation today about what's happening in terms of the negotiations to get out of that bankruptcy protection.
My hunch is not very many people know that anything is happening. Why is that?
Absolutely. If you talk to someone on the streets and ask them about these court cases, they might not be aware of them. Since 2019, these negotiations for this settlement have really been happening behind closed doors. These are conversations that are happening between the provinces and the tobacco companies. Health organizations like ourselves are also not at the table. And so that's really why we want to bring this to light today, to make folks aware of what's happening, but also the opportunities that are at stake.
Now, I guess because these are all behind closed doors negotiations, there haven't been, we don't have any documents that we've been able to look at, or there's not much talk about, nothing's leaking out. Why don't we know more about what's going on there?
Yeah, we really don't know. It's been very tight-lipped. It's a closed door approach. And so we really don't know the ins and outs of the conversation and the negotiation that's happening. But what is critical is that because in order for the tobacco companies to get out of bankruptcy protection, they really require the provinces to agree. So if a settlement is reached, the provinces have a lot of leverage here. And so we really want to ensure that the provinces use that leverage to get not just financial compensation from the tobacco companies, but actually push for public health measures and further tobacco control policy.
You won't be surprised to hear we did contact the Government of Ontario in hopes of getting some kind of statement or indication of where things are at. And we heard back from a spokesperson for the Attorney General, Doug Downey. And I'm going to read you what was on that statement.
Sure.
Due to a 2019 court order, all communications made among the parties in the course of the mediation must be confidential. Accordingly, we are not able to comment on our position in the ongoing settlement negotiations. What do you think of that?
Sure. Well, we know, like we said, that they are closed doors, so we really don't expect more of a comment than that. But we really want to use this opportunity and this platform that you've graciously allowed us to have here to talk about some of the other things that the province should be considering in this settlement. That if a settlement happens, we're asking for the province to look at a suite of measures. Things like ensuring that there's about 10% of the settlement that goes to an independent fund that would be focused on tobacco control. Things like ending all tobacco promotion that remains in Canada. Perhaps requiring additional payouts by the tobacco industry if we don't meet our tobacco reduction targets. And then publicly disclosing the almost $6 million pages of internal tobacco industry documents that have come forward as part of these lawsuits.
Now, have you ever had an opportunity to sit down with someone from the Attorney General's office to let them know that's what you hope to get out of these negotiations?
Well, we're doing a series of advocacy efforts on top of just speaking publicly to folks. We have an open letter currently out to the Premier. We also have a website where we're trying to educate and do letter writing policies to really inform and help get that message across.
And the we is who?
So the big we is, so I'm part of the Canadian Lung Association. Collectively with the Canadian Cancer Society and Heart and Stroke, we've been really working on this call.
So I guess you're not really sure that anybody who's in the negotiating room knows what you want if you haven't met with them directly.
That's right. And that's why it's really important that this open call is out here, that we are, really highlighting the issue and bringing the importance of this unique opportunity. This is a once-in-a-lifetime historic opportunity to not just recoup costs, but to change the way that we interact with the tobacco industry. So it really is absolutely critical that that message is delivered and is heard.
These negotiations have been going on for like 4 years now.
Yes.
Is that typical? Is it supposed to go on that long?
Well, the entire lawsuits in the United States lasted 4 years, so we're taking a little bit longer, but it's important that we get it right. So, let's make sure that, speed is important, certainly, because we have Canadians dying every year that this negotiation goes on. But it is important that we get it right.
Do you have confidence that the people who are negotiating on behalf of the people of Ontario are up to the job?
Well, all we can do is continue to advocate, continue to make sure that we've done everything that we can during the process of these negotiations to make sure that our message is heard, and hope that that opportunity is not lost.
I see the big 4 things that you want here, you just told us about, but short of that, what would you consider to be an acceptable outcome from this process?
Well, it really needs to, the foremost, most important thing is really to have funds set aside beyond the settlement that are independent of government, that are focused on tobacco control. Canada has long been a leader in tobacco control worldwide. Countries have looked to us for some of our important measures. The first to have graphic health warnings. We have very robust plain and packaging regulations. In fact, today, the Government of Canada is making an announcement to have warnings directly on cigarettes in Canada. That would be the first worldwide. So, we've really been a leader. But it is critical that coming out of settlements and lawsuits that are about the wrongdoing of the industry, that we set ourselves up to better control that industry in the future. And that really requires sustained and dedicated funding.
Well, you say to that end, you would ban all promotion. Now, we know advertising's been gone for a long time, but what else is out there promoting that you want to see an end to?
Right. So gone are the days of, the sponsorship and the fireworks shows that many of us remember, but there are still a few areas that tobacco companies are allowed to promote their products. These are places where people are 18 and older. So they might be in, bars, et cetera, that require folks to be of a certain age. It could be through direct messaging. So we've come a long way, but really, these lawsuits, again, are based on the harm that these products cause. And so, it seems absurd to continue to promote those products beyond the lawsuits.
You were a smoker once upon a time.
Long, long time ago, of course, I socially smoked. I grew up in an era where smoking was everywhere. I waitressed in a bar where, I could choose to work in the smoking section or the non-smoking section for my shift. So this is not something that is that long of a history, right? Many of us remember this time when these products were everywhere and where smoke was everywhere. So it's critical that we have these tobacco control initiatives that are focused on making policy change. I really credit the fact that I don't smoke today with the work of my colleagues who prevented tobacco from being allowed indoors, out of bars and restaurants, out of public places. The less accessible that product became, the less interested it became for me.
Well, keep us surprised with how the negotiations are going when you know anything, and we'll have you back and you can comment on what they eventually come up with and whether it's any good.
We will, absolutely. And let's hope that, the province seizes this opportunity to, not just get financial compensation, but really to protect the future harm for Canadians.
Gotcha. That's Sarah Butson, Public Affairs and Policy Analyst with the Canadian Lung Association. Sarah, thanks for visiting us
Thanks
at TVO.
so much for having me.
And that is the agenda for Wednesday, May 31st, 2023. As municipalities across Ontario face budget shortfalls, including the biggest one in the capital city, the debate about who should pay for growth is heating up again. We'll take a look at that tomorrow. Also, why bike lanes might become a ballot question in the race for Toronto Mayor. I'm Steve Paikin. Thanks for watching TVO, for joining us online at tvo.org, and we'll see you again tomorrow.
The Agenda with Steve Paikin is made possible through generous philanthropic contributions from viewers like you. Thank you for supporting TVO's journalism.